According to the Virginia Mercury, 4 weeks before the April 21st referendum, early voting shows stronger turnout in GOP-leaning areas. But Virginia Democrats and Democratic veterans rally for a yes vote in the redistricting referendum. It stayed the water. I'm your host, Eric Claville, and you're joining us for our 2026, April 21st, Redistricting Referendum Series. Once again, I want to thank you for joining us, as you always do, as we broadcast from the campus of the Norfolk State University, home of the Spartan Nation, from none other than WNSB, Hot 91, the soul of VA. We hope that you're enjoying this beautiful weather that we're having now. I think it's spring. We didn't know, like last month it was cold, it was raining, we had tornado warnings across the country, blizzard warnings, and now it's warm. But I know it's spring because the pollen is here. So we want to make sure that you are staying well in this pollen season. But as they say, spring showers bring May flowers. So we're hoping that this will be a very light pollen season. But whatever the case may be, we're thankful for the seasons that we have. Last month, or really earlier this month, we finished up our General Assembly series, which we do every year, where we look and analyze bills and laws and statutes that went through the General Assembly and now are sitting on the desk of the governor, waiting for signature, veto, or just not signing them at all and allowing them to become law. And then, of course, we have reconvene session coming up on the 22nd of April. But before that, within the next 5.5 weeks, we're looking at one of the most important constitutional referendums that we have probably voted for in this Commonwealth in a very, very long time. And that is the Congressional Redistricting Map constitutional referendum. Now, this has been very controversial for many reasons. Of course, we have in Virginia a 6-5, 6 Democratic holding seats in Virginia and 5 Republican seats. But because of the president asking Republican-leaning states, and the state legislators are actually doing it in Texas, Florida, of course, Indiana, and others, in North Carolina, they have now redrawn, Missouri is also another, they've redrawn their congressional maps to give more seats in the midterm election coming up in November so that the Republican Party will have a better chance of keeping power. Now, the president did this because he's reading the tea leaves just like everybody else, and the Republican Party, especially MAGA, is in trouble based upon the policies and the actions of this White House, and also the kind of lame duck Republican Party as well, under the Speaker of the House, Kevin Johnson, and also in the Senate under Senator Thune, who runs the Senate for the Republican Party. Now, when we take a look at what this actually does with the balance of power, first of all, it is definitely unprecedented for a sitting president to ask state legislators to actually redraw their districts out loud, and it's also unprecedented that they actually did it. Now, the way that this works is that every 10 years, we do something called the U.S. Census. Once the U.S. Census is taken, what happens is that now we take a look at population. Every state does it, even the United States. And we look at population for several reasons. Number one, we look at where population is going for commerce purposes, for school tax purposes on the local level, and tax revenue to see where we're building schools and so forth. For commerce, we look at it to see where businesses will invest their dollars, where the population is going. Where do we now need to spend dollars for transportation, for the highways and the like, to increase interstates? And another reason we look at the U.S. Census, we take those numbers to look at where population is shifted in order for us as a country to determine the appropriation of our 435 congressional seats in the House of Congress. Now, there are 535 seats by the Constitution. There are several members, such as territories in District of Columbia, that actually have seats in Congress, not in the Senate, but in Congress, for representation purposes. And there are some voting regulations with them and so forth. However, for the most part, we have 535 seats. By the Constitution, every state gets 2 U.S. senators, no matter how big or how small. California has 2, Virginia has 2, Rhode Island has 2, Montana has 2, Nebraska has 2. Everybody's got 2, right? That gives us 100. But in the House, there are only 435 total congressional seats. So if population is lost in a state, currently in Virginia we have 11, if we gain population, and that means that we may end up with another seat, which means 12 at the end of the census. However, if we lose population, we may lose a seat and end up with 10. So, and that seat goes wherever population is going. With that being the case, that's done every 10 years. However, the president has requested out loud that Republican states redraw their lines mid-decade at the 5-year mark for the sole purpose of giving him and the Republican Party more Republican seats so that they could win the midterm election. Now, this is nothing unusual for our president. We know he has done something like this before. Remember Georgia voting, where he asked the Secretary of State to find him 11,000 some odd plus votes in order to win Georgia in the last election, not the 2024, but the 2020 election. So this is nothing new. And of course, there's plenty on the record about it. So in order to bring back the balance of power, what Democratic states have done, such as California under Gavin Newsom, here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Maryland, and several others are looking at it doing it as well, along with several other Republican states. They're looking to bring the balance back, and they're redrawing their congressional lines. Now, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have a process where this has to be done by a constitutional referendum, which is why on the 21st of this month, early voting has already started, but in the 21st of this month, we will vote as a Commonwealth to determine how our lines will be redrawn, which would now provide Democrats with 10 seats in order to combat the additional seats gained by Republicans in states like Missouri, North Carolina, Texas, and Florida. Now, some people, Democrats, you're going to see advertisements that say this is a good thing. On the Republican side, you're going to see advertisements that say this is a bad thing. But the issue is, how will the country look, after the midterm election? And this is all based upon how congressional seats are divided up. Now, if the president is asking for Republican states to give an imbalance, to tilt the scale, then Democrats believe it's only right for them to even it out, to tilt the scales back. And some states are in alignment with that. And in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we got to vote on it. So one great thing about it is that here we leave it up to the people. Now, with that being the case, we got to look at the messaging. On the last show, we spoke to a journalist, Roger Chesley, and we looked at the mismessaging and the false messaging that had the Republicans or conservative-led PACs are campaigning, and more specifically to African Americans. They're using mailers. They're using black Republicans to push the narrative that for black Americans, this is a bad thing. In other words, if you vote for this, we voted for the Civil Rights Voting Act, which most Republicans in southern states voted against it and didn't want it. But the Voting Rights Act, and then of course all the legislation and the cases against it. But they're saying that if you vote for this gerrymandering is bad for you as African Americans. But in actuality, it's false messaging. And we discussed it in our last show with Roger Chesley, veteran journalist, in which we looked at this and found that it was mismessaging. So there are a lot of people out there, even listening to the show, that are confused. But the Democrats and Democratic and pro redistricting, they have advertisements out there. You see Congressman Bobby Scott. You see individuals from the NAACP. You see advocates for voting rights that are now pushing President Barack Obama, former president. They're pushing ads and advertisement in order to right the ship, in order to give the positive narrative. So I want to take a look now at what the Democrats are actually doing. Now, just this past week, Speaker Scott, he dismissed early voting concerns as party leaders say Democratic-leaning voters often cast ballots later in early voting window. However, we also find that 4 weeks before this referendum on April 21st, early voting shows stronger turnout in GOP-leaning areas. So because of this, Democrats are holding fundraising. They hold a fundraising edge as analysts warn enthusiasm gap and messaging challenges could shape this outcome. So I want to take a look at this through two articles written by Marcus Schmidt from the Virginia Mercury and take a look at where this is going based upon what the Republicans are doing and what the Democrats are doing. Now, in the weeks leading up to this referendum, we're also going to bring in guests to talk about why this is a good thing. We're going to bring in guests to talk about the efforts on the ground floor. We're going to bring in guests to talk about, what this means for the Commonwealth of Virginia. But according to this article, when we take a look at the voting, early voting data compiled by Virginia Public Access Project said that more than 354,000 ballots were cast statewide as of last week, Monday. Already. Now, that's a steady acceleration since early voting began March 6th, which continues till April 18th. Now, this pace marks a sharp increase from the opening voting days when roughly 73,000 ballots were cast by March 10th. Now, this is a clear sign that engagement is starting to pick up. People are starting to notice now. It's picking up and ahead of this April 21st referendum. But, one thing about these numbers, beneath those top line numbers, there's a deeper divide, according to Marcus Schmidt. Now, let's take a look at the breakdown in Republican strongholds and Democratic strongholds. Now, when we take a look at these numbers, early participation is going to vary by region, with Republican-leaning areas generally posting higher turnout rates so far. And you would think that, right? Because if you take a look, this plan eliminates 4 Republican congressional districts, or leaning congressional GOP-leaning districts. Now, in some of these GOP strongholds, between 10 and 15% of registered voters have already cast their ballots. Wow, that is tremendous. Now, keep in mind, Republicans actually fought against early voting. Just throwing that out there. It's the legislative record, but they're using it. Of course, they started using it during Governor Youngkin's campaigning in order to win the election for governor and also in the midterm for Virginia. Now, this 10 to 15%, it outpaces Democratic-leaning areas, particularly in Nova or Northern Virginia, where early voting infrastructure tends to ramp up in this particular cycle. Now, when we take a look at the congressional district level, the patterns are the same. So districts currently represented by Republicans, they're seeing a stronger early turnout than those held by Democrats. Now, when we take a look at also the partisan of this is a sign that partisan intensity around the referendum that could reshape Virginia's congressional delegation ahead of the midterms will become very vocal. All right. So according to one political analyst, Bob Holsworth, he said, I think Democrats have to be worried. They have a financial advantage, but the challenge the Democrats have here is that they don't really have a face for their campaign. So what does this mean for the election? What does this mean for the future of our congressional districts? And what does this mean for the future of the midterm elections and the rest of the Trump administration? It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Eric LaVille, and you're joining us for our 2026 Redistricting Referendum series. For the next several weeks, we will be delving into how the referendum will impact the Commonwealth of Virginia, also midterm elections for the country, and the rest of the Trump administration, because he is depending upon this, other states rejoin their congressional districts in Republican-leaning states to get more seats. But the Commonwealth of Virginia, along with other Democratic states, are looking to bring back the balance of power. But according to data, early voting in GOP-leaning state areas and regions are outpacing the Democratic region. According to a longtime analyst, he believes that Democrats should be worried because of the lack of enthusiasm and also the lack of a face. So let's take a look at the local data and see where these disparities are. Across Virginia, many of the highest turnout jurisdictions so far are smaller Republican-leaning counties, like in central and western parts of the state. This, again, you should not be surprised, right? Let's take a look. Matthews County, strong Republican leaning. The locality of Middle Peninsula, where GOP candidates consistently get more than 60% of the vote in local, statewide, and federal elections. Now, they have posted the highest early voting rate statewide so far, with roughly 16% of registered voters already casting ballots as of last week, Monday. That is a major, major number. Now, when you take a look at similar patterns, GOP-leaning counties are exceeding statewide averages, as we mentioned before, and outpacing more Democratic urban-leaning districts or jurisdictions. Now, let's take a look at some of the larger Democratic strongholds, like Fairfax, Loudoun County, Prince William counties. They have reported a significantly lower early voting rates in the first weeks of balloting, often well under 5% of registered voters. Now, let's just do the simple math. If you're talking 10 to 15% in stronghold Republican counties, and you're talking less than 5% in a very astute, educated, and voting engaged areas like, again, Fairfax, Loudoun County, Prince William County, and they're less than 5%, so far, that's a 10, maybe 12% advantage in early voting that the Republicans have. Now, put this all together. This suggests that Republican-leaning areas are currently driving turnout, both in raw participation and as of a share of registered voters, while Democrat-leaning regions have been slower to engage. Now, let's take a look and see what the Democrats are saying. Now, Speaker Scott, as I mentioned last week, he dismissed early voting concerns as the party leaders say that the Democratic-leaning voters often cast ballots, in the early voting window. Now, when you take a look at this, during a press conference featuring Democratic veterans in the front of the USS Wisconsin in Norfolk, Speaker Scott pointed to voter data he said closely tracks past election cycles. And he said this signals confidence within the party. Now, he said, if you look at our voters right now, the last cycle in 2025, at the same point of early voting, we were about 60-40 in voter profile. He said right now it's like 59-41. He says we're good. He says, I feel really good about this election. Now, those are very optimistic numbers. We see what the data is, through the Virginia Public Access Project. So it's not so much 60-40 or 59-41, but you're probably looking at more of a, I would say, 70-30 than anything else on the Republican leaning, if you really want to be careful with this. Now, when we take a look at what the referendum is asking, once again, decide a one-time mid-decade redraw, one time, of Virginia's congressional districts. Supporters say the measure is intended to counter Republican-led efforts, which we talked about. Now, when we take a look at Speaker Scott, who is a U.S. Navy veteran, he was also joined by Democratic leaders from military backgrounds, including former Governor Ralph Northam, who framed the referendum as both a political and also a constitutional issue, tying their support to their service and oath to defend the Constitution. Now, Governor Northam was an 8-year U.S. Army veteran. He said the measure is fundamentally about preserving the democratic norms. According to the former governor, he said there is nothing more important than fair elections and openness to voting. He also added that Virginia has historically upheld peaceful transfers of power. He's right. He described recent developments as a, quote, power grab and attack on our democracy, unquote. And he said the referendum is meant to level the playing field. He also said that he argued that failing to respond to redistricting moves in Republican-led states would leave Virginia at a disadvantage, saying the Democrats cannot sit back as a Commonwealth while others stack the deck. He also said that it's about our democracy, saving our democracy, and stopping the power grab that's going on from the MAGA Republicans. Also, U.S. Air Force veteran Delegate Michael Fagans, Democrat of Virginia Beach, who is also a Norfolk State alum, behold, he also gave his support. And he said it is rooted in the same oath he took while serving, emphasizing the importance of protecting voting access. Now, he said, I also took an oath to defend the Constitution. That oath didn't end when I took off the uniform. He said, right now, we're really living in what is known as, he said, we're living in what is not known as normal times. I think many people can agree with that. Delegate Fagans also recalled voting from overseas while deployed. He said, describing it as a powerful reminder of how important it is to ensure ballots are counted and also why voices should be heard. Now, when you take a look at this, he said that the referendum ultimately leaves the decision in the hands of voters, despite what described as misinformation and efforts undermining participation. He said one of the most important things we want people to know is that this is temporary, and the voters ultimately get to decide what happens. Now, when you take a look at the chair for the Virginia Democrats, Veterans and Military Families Caucus, Susan Hippen, she connected the referendum to broader national dynamics. She argued that political instability, policy decisions in Washington have tangible consequences for service members and their families. Now, she pointed out and said that the chaos in Washington isn't just political, it has real impacts on our veterans and military families. She also cited concerns about cuts to services like job uncertainty and also military readiness. Of course, here in Hampton Roads, we are very familiar with military readiness, with the president calling our brave men and women off to serve in our phenomenal Navy, aircraft carriers and battleships and supply ships and all the ships that support. And individuals had to go. So there are families now that are without their loved ones because they are now supporting the efforts of this particular war effort. So again, our men and women are out there. So we understand readiness and we understand job uncertainty as well. Now, another thing that Susan did, she pointed to the redistricting actions in states like Texas and North Carolina, which I've stated, saying that Virginia is now asking voters for permission to respond in kind. She said protecting democracy isn't separate from supporting veterans. It is directly connected, adding that the referendum is about maintaining checks and balances and ensuring that no one can rig the election system. Now, this proposal, of course, we know has drawn national attention, legal challenges, including disputes over ballot language, timing of the vote, also sparked controversy over campaign messaging, civil rights theme mailers, prompted criticism of both parties. But once again, Speaker Scott downplayed these concerns that competing narratives would confuse voters, saying he trusts Virginians to sort through the information and make their own decisions. He said Virginia voters are smart. He trusts them. They're going to get the right information. They're going to make the right decision. Now, one thing about this is that, of course, it takes a lot to, sort this thing out. That's why we need solid messages across the board. And that's one thing that I'm issuing a clarion call to the Democrats, saying that they have to get a message that is clear, concise, and to the point. Because the Republicans, they're doing their job. They are confusing the effort, and they're getting their message out to their voters. We see about a turnout. So if you really want to even the playing field in this voting, you got to change. You got to get a clear, concise message. You got to get on the ground floor. You got to get this moving. Now, Speaker Scott said, this is Virginia. We don't like kings. 3 days before No Kings protest rallies against President Donald Trump last week, his administration are planned in multiple Virginia cities and across the nation. He said, we have to stand up. He said, we have stood up and we will continue to stand up. We're not going to let somebody steal this next election. Now, once again, when we take a look at the voting itself, one thing about voting is money. When we take a look at the face of the Democrat redistricting, this is what Holsworth said. He said Democrats have built a well-funded operation, but they lacked a central, visible figure to rally voters. Who's the face? Who's out there campaigning every day? They have an argument, but they don't have a face for their argument. Who is that absolute champion? Now, let's take a look at this. He's right. You got to have a face for this. And when you're pushing an effort, you got to have a face. When you oppose an effort, you don't really have to have a face. You just got to create doubt. Sow seeds of discord. Create wedges. That's all you got to do. But if you are championing effort, you have to be the face. So when we take a look at the dollars Again, fundraising effort, clearly Democratic hands. So House Majority Forward is a progressive nonprofit contributing $15 million over the past 6 weeks. Virginians for Fair Elections, the most visible pro-redistricting group. This organization received $5 million donation from the Fund for Policy Reform, which is a nonprofit affiliated with the Open Society Foundations network funded by a Hungarian-American billionaire and philanthropist known by George Soros. Now, the Soros-linked contribution has angered Republicans who have seized on it in their social media messaging. With this, we find that they're saying that their tightness to Democratic local elections and prosecutors. But, with this, I think, according to Holsworth, he's downplayed that political impact of funding sources itself. So, again, I think it's more so about the message. I agree, what this actually means. Now, I want to look at this from a effort. We'll take a look at it from a national effort in our next show and see what the Spanberger shift in national context is and how that is playing out. But when we take a look once again at what is happening on the ground floor, you've got three prominent elected officials and former elected officials: our former governor, Governor Ralph Northam, our current Speaker of the House, and also Delegate Michael Fagans, all Hampton Roads based, who are all military veterans. And they're tying this to the military effort. And, of course, the city of Norfolk, home of the largest naval base in the world. And once again, one of the most impressive fleets. I've had the opportunity to be on the USS Gerald R. Ford. One of the most impressive machines I've ever seen and been on. But when you tie this to the military, when you tie this to the service, when you tie this to what's happening in Iran, it's only the Congress that can check the president. So the question becomes, is Congress checking the president, or are they allowing him to do what he wants to do? I think all of us can see that the Republicans have abrogated their power in Congress, and they're allowing the president to do what he wants to do. Is this sustainable? Is this what Americans really want? Is this really helping the efforts of us and our status in the world? Congress is an equal branch of government. The only way to ensure equality, only way to ensure that the people's voice is heard, the only way in order to bring checks and balances back to our way of government, to Congress, the only way to do it is to get a Congress that speaks for the people. If you believe that our Congress currently speaks, as opposed to currently, while they're keeping their mouths shut, the Republican-controlled Congress, then vote no. But if you believe that by our Republican-controlled Congress keeping their mouths closed, zipped, not speaking out against the president and the White House and their actions, and not speaking for you and the things that you as the people are wanting the president to hear, and stop actions. Congress could stop this war right now. They could stop a lot of things right now, but they have to have the people who are willing to do it. If you believe that we don't have that, then vote yes for this referendum. That's what the two sides are saying. And that's where the messages are. So do your research. Make sure that you become informed and listen to this series, because every week we're going to be talking about this. And because, as I always say, as Virginia goes, so goes the rest of the country. As always, I want to thank you for joining us for Stay the Water. Until next time, be good, be great. God bless. And yes, we'll see you next week.
Hi, I'm Carrie Washington, and you're listening to State of the Water with award-winning host Dr. Eric Claville.